prophets. We're working our way through the minor prophets. We've looked at Obadiah, we've looked at Joel, we've looked at Jonah, and now we're going to look at Amos. And a lot of what I am sharing with you I've actually learned from Abner Chau and some other commentators, but if you have a chance, I'd encourage you check out Abner Chau's videos, or not videos, they're actually just audios on SoundCloud on the minor prophets. But we're going to look at Amos, and Amos is a book about judgment. We're going to spend some time talking about many people's least favorite word in the Bible, judgment. Many of the minor prophets obviously are about judgment, but Amos is really about judgment. Almost every single verse in the book has to do with judgment, so get ready. There are only a handful of verses that are not about judgment. If we're going to talk so much about judgment, though, we need to make sure we understand what we're talking about. And in a sense, really what we want to do is let Amos answer this question. But before we do, let's just think about the word judgment in general. What do we mean when we talk about judgment? How would you define judgment? Well, the word judge has to do with evaluating, making a decision about innocence or guilt, and if guilty, to punish. So there are two key ideas here when we talk about judgment, that of evaluation and that of punishment. Now, why don't people like this concept? Why don't people like the idea of judgment? One reason people don't like it is because they have a wrong idea of God's judgment. Their idea of what it means for God to judge is distorted. Fortunately, we've been helped by Jonah, and we've seen that God's wrath and judgment is not like Jonah's. There is no one more compassionate and more merciful than God. Others, though, don't have so much a distorted view of God's judgment as much as they just don't take it seriously. They don't think that God really does judge. They think people talk a lot about judgment, but it's not going to happen. In the face of all this pressure to minimize God's judgment, the book of Amos is intended to help us take it seriously. Amos was prophesying in the days of Uzziah, it says, and in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash. This makes Amos a contemporary of Isaiah, Hosea, and Jonah. He's probably just a little while after Jonah. Now, even though he mentions Uzziah first, because Amos is from Judah, that's his home, he is prophesying in Israel where Jeroboam is king. And the book of Kings doesn't tell us a lot about Jeroboam, but what we do know, we know from 2 Kings chapter 14. And you can look at 2 Kings 14:23 when you have a chance, and you'll see that Jeroboam reigned 40 years, and he was evil, wicked, and yet he was prosperous, incredibly prosperous. He reigned 40 years, and they say that besides the days of Solomon, this was the most prosperous period of Israel's history. Now, part of the reason for their prosperity was because the greatest empire of the day was having some problems. You remember, these were the days of the big world empires, and Assyria was the big world empire at that point, and they were in charge, and yet they were having many issues back home, and so they were basically leaving Israel alone at this point. Also, you remember how Jonah had gone to Nineveh, which is in Assyria, the capital city, and Nineveh repented, and so it's not surprising they gave Israel some space, and Israel was doing well as a result, at least financially, but definitely not spiritually. And that's why God sent Amos to speak to the nation of Israel, and he gave them a message which was pretty much 100% about a coming judgment. You see, in the first verse, he marks his prophecy as occurring 2 years before the earthquake. And so that was an immediate judgment of God, kind of like the locust plague in Joel, intended to shake things up. And this was a really big earthquake. It was such a big earthquake, it was remembered a couple hundred years later in the book of Zechariah. But this earthquake was only a small picture of a much greater judgment to come. It was not very long until Assyria was going to come and take the nation of Israel into exile. Amos, he was a farmer. He was a herdsman of sheep. You can see that in chapter 7, verses 14 and 15. So he was not trained. He was from the village. He was not even from Israel. He was from Judah. He was not a polished politician, and Israel was a pretty polished place, and he is in the royal court. Micah was kind of a street preacher out with the people. Amos what we would call in America a redneck, and everyone knows it, and they're like, go back to your farm, Amos. We don't need your kind. And here's the point. Jeroboam's reign was very prosperous, and people felt secure. And up comes this farmer from this little out-of-the-way place called Tekoa, and he's talking about judgment. And his name means bearer of burdens, and he is wanting to lay a burden on people's hearts. He's wanting them to feel the heaviness of this. But it's very difficult because they're very religious and they're doing well financially. And so God sends Amos in order to try to wake them up. And so this book is a warning of God's impending judgment. And also he's making it clear this judgment is very, very fair. When it comes, you really don't have a reason to complain, or they will, of course, but they don't have a reason because God's judgment is completely fair. And he starts in chapters 1 and 2 by assuring Israel that God is going to judge the nations. And then he surprises them by making it clear that those nations that God is going to judge includes them. After the title in verse 1, he states the theme in verse 2. He says, the Lord roars. What a way to start a book. This is poetic. He's talking about a lion, and it's as if this lion is hungry and about ready to pounce. And in verse 3, he starts working his way through who the lion is going to pounce on. And he does something interesting. He works through a series of 8 oracles. Now, this is unusual. In Israel, if you say something 7 times, then it's over back in the day. It's like with a chorus. You know, we have choruses, and when we have choruses, you have a certain pattern to how you sing those choruses. And so 7 was kind of normal for a prophet. But they didn't have 8-fold refrains. That didn't make sense to them. And so as Amos is beginning, they're expecting 7 refrains. And he starts working his way through their neighbors. And again, you have to realize that they were not taking judgment very seriously. And one of the reasons, of course, was the wickedness all around them. After all, it seems like God doesn't even notice. And so Amos is like, yes, God does notice. And he begins with Damascus in verse 3. And Damascus is northeast of Israel. And it's the capital of a place called Syria. I don't know if you remember much about Syria, but Syria was a nation you heard a lot about back with Elisha. This is where Naaman was from. And like so many other nations of the ancient world, Damascus was pretty brutal. Syria was brutal. We see what they did here. Amos says they threshed Gilead with instruments of iron. And that could be poetry. Of course, in farming, one way of separating the grain kernels from their outer layer was to put all the grain in a pile, and then you'd have an ox pull a sledge over the pile over and over again. And so Amos could be saying that Syria treated the people of Gilead like they were nothing but grain, crushing them into the ground. Or it could be literal. Gilead was a nice place, apparently. And it could have been that Syria took plows and dug the land up to the point where they just ruined it and made it impossible for Israel to farm it, which, of course, in those days would have caused intense suffering. And they felt like they had gotten away with it. That's really the point. Like God hadn't noticed. But, of course, he had noticed, and he's going to pay them back. And that payback is going to be totally fair. And he identifies 4 aspects of their punishment: fire, breaking, cutting off, and sending into exile. After Damascus, he turns his attention to focus on a place called Gaza in verse 6. Gaza was where the Philistines lived. It's right beside the Mediterranean Sea. In Joel 3:6, we see that they sold the people of Judah and Jerusalem to the Greeks. They looked powerful, they felt powerful, and God says he's going to punish her for her wickedness. Then he goes northwest. He looks at Tyre in verse 9, and their sin was the same as Philistia, and they received the same judgment. There might be an added aspect in that it says they did not remember the covenant of brotherhood. The covenant of brotherhood refers to a relationship, a contract, and it's speaking of a time when there was a relationship between Israel and Tyre. And you can read about that in 2 Samuel 5, 1 Kings 5. And yet, obviously, they turned their back on that, and they were guilty of excessive violence, kidnapping, slavery, and also betrayal. He goes on to Edom in verse 11. And you see what he's doing? He's kind of walking his way around Israel. And he's saying sin is serious. Israel might see all this happening and they might not feel like God is noticing, but God's noticing. And yet, of course, that should cause them to think a little. Like, if God's judging if they're seeing all these nations fall all around them, what about us? But they're probably not feeling it too intensely yet because he's not talking directly to them, though he's getting closer. Now he's talking about their cousins, Edom. Edom pursued his brother with the sword and cast him off without pity. They lacked compassion. They became angry. They wouldn't forgive. When people lose pity and exact vengeance on others, God notices. And so even though Edom was a descendant of Esau, had kind of a unique relationship with Israel, God's judgment is fair, and they would be judged like the rest. Now Ammon, they're due east of Israel, and they were known for brutal kinds of sins. Amos says, ripped open pregnant women in order to enlarge their border. In other words, to get more land. This is pure evil, pure greed. And God says, you know what? I'm going to set your city on fire, and I'm going to cause someone to want your land, and they're going to come and do battle against you, and you're going to lose. Judgment, 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 judgment. So far, we've looked at 5 nations. Here's the 6th, Moab. Amos has been working his way through the nations surrounding Israel, and it's like he's getting closer and closer. Verse 1 of chapter 2, Moab burned alive the king of Edom. In all these nations, it's kind of like chaos. And does God care? God cares. What's Moab doing? They hated the king of Edom so much that after he died, they dug up his bones and burned them. And as a result, God is going to judge them by taking their leadership away from them. We're on to the 7th now, and really this should be the last one. You remember the whole idea of the chorus was 7 lines. So obviously for those listening, there would be a kind of anticipation as it's becoming more and more clear how seriously God takes sin. And as Israel is listening, they've got to be wondering, is it going to be us? Are we the 7th? And then Amos says Judah, and you can almost hear this big sigh of relief. So good, it's not us. It's Judah. They rejected the law of the Lord and they listened to lies. Even though they had this unique relationship with God, they acted like Gentiles. And so now God is going to treat them like Gentiles. And of course, at this point, everybody's ready to go home. Amos is in the town square and he's walked this way through the list of 7, and they're listening, and they're probably like, I think you're in the wrong place, brother. I think you got a little lost on the way from Tekoa. It's nice you came all the way up here to tell us this, but don't you think you should go down south? They're the ones who really need to hear this. And then Amos, it's almost like he taps the microphone and he says, why are you guys turning around? Because I'm not done yet. And they're like, wait, what? And Amos is like, gotcha. You can probably notice as Amos has been sharing these oracles, each one's getting shorter. Almost as if he's rushing to get to his main point, and now he's gotten to his main point. And his main point is how God is going to judge Israel, and how that judgment is really, really fair. And we're going to see more about that judgment in videos to follow.